Start your engines and prepare a mechanised cavalry charge, as today we're talking about the Space Marine Outriders in Warhammer 40k. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Space Marines once more, and in this video I thought we'd do a unit overview for the Outriders, chainsaw wielding fast attack Space Marines with some bolter goodness built in. Let's talk over their models, all the rules on the datasheets and the other models that you can buy in to support them, some damage and defense comparisons, and how I think about using them in game. The Outrider bikes function as fast attacks for the Space Marines, rapid deployment fast movers that kind of exemplify the Space Marine way of war, striking very fast and hitting very hard, able to range ahead of the main Space Marine force if necessary, and strike at weak points in the enemy army, often employing hit and run tactics to run away and stay safe before the enemy has a chance to recover. They fight with Astartes chainswords and twin bolters mounted on their bikes, and as with all Space Marine bikes coming before them, are usually employed in great numbers by the White Scars chapter. They very much fill in the role of cavalry for their Space Mongol heritage. The models themselves I think are considered nice enough. They're Primaris Marines that came out of early 9th edition in the Indomitors box set, basically the spiritual updates to the long-standing Space Marine biker squad. I think the models are fairly effective, though perhaps have slightly low clearance for armoured bikers that you might expect. They're not going to be able to handle rough terrain all that well. I did feel at the time that the kit was maybe just perhaps surprisingly basic, really. The old style Space Marine bikers had really quite a lot of special options, including multiple different special weapons and some power weapons on the Sergeant. I think it could have been a really quite nice move to at least allow things like a power weapon or power fist on the squad's Sergeant model, as it could have significantly helped them punch up a bit better against more armoured targets. Otherwise they're just locked to chainswords, so generally fight against infantry pretty well, but not really anything else. From Games Workshop, their kit's £37.50, €50 or $60. At that kind of price, I wouldn't say they're one of Games Workshop's better buys, really. With such a simple kit, they do feel maybe a little bit easy build compared with some of their more multi-part plastic kits that are a lot more customizable. And at the moment, you don't really get all that many points in game for them as well. They cost 95 points and arguably could be a little bit overcosted at that price, as we'll talk about. They have a points per dollar ratio of 1.6, a little bit lower than most. If you're looking for them, you might be able to find a few second-hand, either from previous discount bundles like the Elite box set in 9th edition, Indomitus, the White Scars Battle Force, or maybe even the Imperium magazine. Might be worth checking eBay, as they do crop up from time to time. As ever, if you were looking to pick up the kits at a discount though, then places like Element Games in the UK and Gap Games in Australia stock them at lower prices than you get from Games Workshop. Both are links down in the video description. Those links do help support the channel at no extra cost to yourself if you use them. Getting into their datasheet, and this is the Outrider datasheet from 10th edition from the latest Space Marine Codex. As per the update for the Munitorum Field Manual, they're 95 points per squad of 3 of them, 190 for 6 of them, and you can add 1 Invader ATV into the unit. That will cost you an additional 70 points. Essentially it means that you're paying around about 32 points per bike, and that gets you a fairly fast moving biker that goes 12 inches, with a relatively sturdy profile at toughness 5, 4 wounds and a 3+ save. I'd say the defense is at least fairly good for the points cost. You're generally going to be a little bit tougher than some similar equivalents, say like Eradicators or Aggressors. And their speed is quite nice, though being a mounted unit they'll have to go around terrain, they won't be able to go through ruined walls or things like infantry can, which might limit their possibilities just a little bit. Their special rule is a movement one called Turbo Boost. This means that each time a unit advances, you don't have to roll, you just automatically add 6 inches to the move characteristic, so it's an 18-inch move if they advance. I guess that could often be enough to allow them to hop from cover to cover and keep safe from enemy firepower. If they do want to deal any damage at all though, it's not going to be much use, not unless you've got something like the Gladius Force or the Stormlance Force to allow them to advance and do damage somehow. Finally, they've got an objective control of 2 on their profile. That seems reasonable enough for the points cost, I think. Around 100 points of fast movers having OC of 6 seems fairly standard for 40k. For their damage output, the standard Outriders get a twin bolt rifle and a heavy bolt pistol. The twin bolt rifle gets you 2 shots at strength 4, AP-1 and damage 1. That goes out to 24 inches, so can often threaten the backfield if you're moving these guys forward fast. And the twin link special rule does at least mean that they'll reliably get some wounds on the unit if you do manage to get some hits. Still though, I wouldn't say it's standout shooting damage for a 95 point unit. In combat, the standard Outriders hit with their chainswords. They each get 4 attacks at strength 4, AP-1 and damage 1. Remember in 9th edition when they had their extra 2 attacks on the charge, unfortunately that one's gone away. I feel like just with these base chainsaw attacks, then some sort of nice extra rule on the charge could have been quite fun. Maybe giving them lance or something could have been interesting, perhaps. For a squad of 3, you get 12 attacks out of them, so around about 4 or 5 dead termagants. They should make a fairly nice mess of most light infantry units, or around about 2 wounds to enemy space marines, though they're just not very good against anything like terminators or vehicles, either with high toughness or high saves. I feel like the damage profiles are probably the single most limiting thing for the Outriders, really. They don't do anything that isn't a strength 4 and AP -1 hit, so if you're fighting against things that profile really just can't handle, then you're not really going to be doing anything too exciting damage-wise with these. We'll run their numbers against one of their competitors later in the video though. Before that though, probably worth mentioning their other options that they can take in the unit, and that would be the Invader ATV that you can have one of in the squad, and then the Chaplain on bike, which is the only option for attached characters, at least from the core codex. The Invader ATV is 70 points to add into the unit, and gets you a profile that's 8 wounds, so basically 2 Outriders glued together pretty much. For the cost, it would actually slightly lower the per point defense of the unit, as it costs slightly more than 2 Outriders put together, but has the defensive profile of 8 wounds, technically a little bit more susceptible to massive damage weapons. For its war gear, it gets the same bolt rifles and pistol that the standard ones get, but with the addition of the second marine gunner getting a big gun of some description, either an onslaught Gatling cannon with 8 attacks at strength 5, damage 1 and devastating wounds, or a multi-melter with its 2 strength 9 shots and d6 damage to 18 inches. Obviously the two give you very different damage profiles, though I'd be a bit more tempted by the multi-melter overall. It just feels like volume fire and handling hordes just isn't really what the unit needs all that much, so anything that you can do to make them a little bit more threatening against heavier infantry or tanks and things seems like a good idea. Otherwise, it gets you 5 attacks in combat at strength 4 and AP 0, quite a lot worse than the roughly 2 Outriders worth of points that it costs. And unlike the core Outrider datasheet, which has got the supporting fire type rule to gun down enemies that were trying to shoot your Outrider squad, it doesn't get that if it's actually within the unit. Unfortunately, I probably wouldn't rate the Invader ATV as really all that efficient for the squad. I feel like relative to a lot of the other things that you can buy in Codex Space Marines, 70 points just isn't really all that great for the damage or defense of this thing. I feel like the main reason that you'd probably want one is if you were going all in on buffs and were trying to make the absolute most out of it, an Outrider unit. Perhaps could be a bit more interesting in the Stormlance task force when you've got a fair few more stratagem options to support them. The other option for buying in from the core codex is the Chaplain on bike. He's 75 points, having gone down a little bit from his release incarnation, and the only option that he has to lead is the Outrider squad. Now Games Workshop has taken the Firstborn Bikers away. Profile wise, he gets 5 wounds with a 4+ invulnerable save, not really too bad durability for a character. He adds another set of twin bolt rifles into the unit, and then his main draw is giving them 3 buffs, a 5+ leadership, and both better ranged and combat. In combat, he gives you a +1 to wound litany. I think that's really quite a big deal for the chainswords at least, as it helps overcome the low strength of 4, means they'll be wounding vehicles on a 5+, and things like terminators on a 4. Generally a fairly solid buff to combat damage. At range, he has the Catechism of Fire, which allows you to get devastating wounds against one unit within 12 inches. Not the worst with those twin bolt rifles, where you could potentially fish for the 6s if it made the most sense to. Again, that one's going to be quite a nice boost against both things that are tough and have high saves, which I guess is helpful to try and round them out a bit. Just for interest, here's the damage output of a max squad with a Chaplain. 335 points worth of Space Marine Biker here, so it's really not a small investment at all. When it's shooting, it'll kill around 7 Termagants, around about 3 Space Marines or 1 or 2 Terminators, around 6 wounds to a 3+ save vehicle. And in combat those numbers are broadly similar, but a bit better against the lower toughness targets like the Termagants and the Space Marines. You kill 15 hordes or around about 5 standard Astartes. Unfortunately though, even putting those together, they don't add up to enormously impressive numbers at this kind of points cost, and this one does hinge on both getting a full amount of shooting and a charge off. You might just be a little bit harder pressed to hide a unit with really quite such a big footprint as this one. They're not going to quite as comfortably fit behind ruins, and if they are, you are going to have some bikers that are trailing the pack by a bit. I guess their durability isn't shocking, but my first thoughts are for this sort of points investment, the numbers aren't standout. There are a few options for other support within Codex Space Marines though. Just for more basic generic things, Oath of Moment can always help out for a bit of damage, though the same applies anywhere. Armor of Contempt could be useful for them. I guess they're a unit that's more likely than most to get hit by high AP attacks with a lot of wounds and no invulnerable saves. And Grenades could definitely help out their perhaps slightly lackluster damage against targets that they struggle with. An extra 3 mortal wounds could tip an important balance somewhere. As mentioned, they don't really have that much character support besides the Chaplain on bike within the core Codex. There are a few things that could buff their shooting a little bit, like Incursors or the Storm Speeder Hail Strike, though given that their damage output's kind of split between the two and a little bit weedy either way, it's not really a unit that's worth supporting that much. If you do run independent ATVs, then you could use them to reactively fire if your opponent shoots the Outrider squad nearby. I feel like that's perhaps just a little bit questionable to bother buying in with, partly because the Invader only has a kind of short range, so it might not be in range in the first place. I'm not sure its damage output is quite scary enough to really stop them just trying to do that anyway, and they could just take down the Invader ATV first. Basically, for the most part, for the core Space Marine rules, just perhaps the things like the odd Armour of Contempt and grenades might be handy enough. Though in the Space Marine Codex, it does seem that the Stormlance Task Force is really building around the Outriders quite hard. It's generally a melee-themed detachment with advance and charge for everything in it, and it's got really quite a lot of options that can only be used by mounted units, so unless you're playing Dark Angels Raven Wing or Space Wolves with Thunderwolves, Outriders are basically the unit of this detachment, both having the mounted keywords and being a combat unit. Admittedly, it does give them several helpful advantages. They get to advance and charge, so that's basically an 18-inch move and then still charge, so you could allow first turn charges with that. And then quite a lot of stratagems, it just locks to certain units. There's a -1 for a -1 to hit and wound against shooting, which is actually genuinely quite a good reactive durability stratagem. That's only mounted or fly vehicles, so not really all that much within the Space Marine army. There's a 1 command point 1 to give your shooting the assault keyword. That would be genuinely quite nice with Outriders if they're likely to be advancing and charging anyway. 1 CP for 6 to 12 bolter shots that are twin links could be handy if they can hit something that most of the rest of your army can't. There's a 2 CP one for advancing 9 inches, so again that's an even further threat range there. Potentially powerful, but I feel like 2 CP to gain 3 inches towards a charge just might not be enough, unless it does make a very borderline charge into very likely. Finally, there's 1 CP for re-rolling charge rolls and gaining lance. Again, a +1 to wound could be kind of helpful for these guys. Maybe a little bit annoying that you have to commit to it before you actually charge in though. Even with a re-roll, sometimes you might fail a charge and just a waste of CP then and there. Finally, a couple of their enhancements are relevant. The Chaplain can get an extra +1 strength and extra AP, and more so on the charge. I feel like that is fairly relevant for making them a bit more of a general purpose combat unit. That one could be handy enough. And there's also one to help manipulate strategic reserve, though I feel like in general, given that they move very fast, you might be more tempted to start them on the board, as that's sort of the point of having fast movement. I feel like if you are taking this detachment outside of Dark Angels or Space Wolves, you probably wouldn't be using it unless you were running Outriders. Out of all the buffs, I do think that Advance and Charge is kind of useful, and the durability stratagem against shooting is really nice. Definitely a fairly well-rounded support package for them. Otherwise, for the Codex detachments, the Gladius I think is probably the other good one for them. It's got access to either advancing and shooter and advancing and charging, and other ways to get extra AP as well, which is rather nice with the chainswords. Lance and extra AP does make them a lot more general purpose, particularly nice against things like standard Space Marines with a 3+ save. Otherwise, the Vanguard Spearhead adds extra durability at greater than 12 inches. The Ironstorm one could be alright for a single reroll for an Invader multi-melter, though is a bit wasted on a standard chainsword attack. And the Firestorm Force seems alright for them. Strength 5 shooting within 12 inches with the assault keywords, so you can move 18 inches if desired, and a +1 to wound stratagem in the Crucible of Battle, though that might be better used elsewhere. Otherwise, for the Divergent Chapters, Blood Angels can make them fightier, though they will be competing against the other Blood Angels units. They're going to struggle to get in a look edgeways against Jump Infantry, given that they've got so much more support. Black Templars get the Feel No Pain for a bit more durability in their detachment, plus some melee support buffs. The Death Watch do have some handy enough damage boosts from their core detachment rules, and you could use the Bolter stratagems. That could actually be kind of worth it in a big Outrider squad if you are running one for some reason. And there are a couple of other bike things relevant for them. You can take 2 of them in the Fortis kill team, which I think is handy enough given the competition for the points there. But for standard Outrider squads in themselves, they will be competing against the Deathwatch bikers, and with access to special weapons there, they might well be the way to go. For the Dark Angels, they do have a couple of potentially useful stratagems, though I think in reality perhaps the biggest deal for them is the option to have Samael in the unit. He adds a fair bit of his own threat and allows you to advance, shoot and charge as well, and that's quite a big deal to allow them to move 18 inches and still give all their damage output both at range and in melee, maybe enough to actually make them kind of interesting as a very fast moving threat, with the Master of the Raven Wing himself there to actually help with the damage. For that role, they will be competing against the Black Knights, though, who do hit significantly harder with better AP. and they're fairly fearsome close-range plasma talons. I feel like overall they're probably going to win out despite the extra 15 points there, though I feel like for actually trying to make Outriders work as much as possible, Samael leading them and maybe in the Stormlance force could be one of the most interesting ways to actually make them genuinely kind of powerful. Finally, for Space Wolves, they're competing against the pretty much cheaper and better Thunder Wolves, seeing as they're only 30 points per model, have lots of good character upgrades, plus hit significantly harder in melee and get a 4+ invulnerable save. The Outriders really are going to struggle to overcome that, really. Finally, for the core codex, I thought it could be kind of interesting to do a quick damage and durability comparison against the Jump Intercessors, which I feel like could be seen as quite a good rival for their battlefield role, skirmishing with enemy light infantry and moving extra fast to either get to primary objectives or zip around doing secondary objectives. In general, I'd rate the Jump Intercessors as being a little bit better on the whole secondary and action type thing. They do get built-in deep strike, are cheaper per unit, and infantry for interacting with terrain a little bit better, so it's kind of the Outriders that need to prove themselves with raw stats there. First up for durability, 3 Outriders take 81 lasgun hits to bring down, 24 heavy bolter hits or 6 las cannon hits. When weighted to 95 points or so, the Jump Intercessors perhaps are a little bit ahead, though it kind of depends on the sort of firepower. They're better against anything that doesn't care about the toughness difference compared with the Outriders, like lasguns or las cannons. But the few things that do care about, from going toughness 4 to toughness 5, they'll generally be a little bit weaker against, things like strength 5 heavy bolters or strength 4 bolters. Probably overall a little bit of a side grade on the durability front. Unfortunately for damage output, there really isn't all that much comparison though. This one's weighted to 95 points worth of models, and it represents each unit shooting and then following that up with a charge, which in theory shouldn't be too bad for the Outriders given that they've each got twin bolt guns. Unfortunately for the Outriders though, it just really isn't all that close. They're pretty much the same sort of damage output against hordes, the Jump Intercessors only slightly outperforming against termagants, though there's not much in it. But then everything from a standard Space Marine and above, the Jump Intercessors just do significantly better. They've got a couple of plasma pistols they can shoot with before they charge in. Mortal Wound impact hits does quite well. And their Sergeant can take a built-in Power Fist as well, which again adds loads, particularly against standard Space Marines, as well as against heavier stuff. It means that against things like Terminators and Rhinos, the Jump Intercessors do around about 3 times the damage. To be honest, I think that these numbers alone really aren't that great for the Outriders, means that they feel like they're pretty much directly outclassed by the Jump Intercessors here. Obviously they do slightly different things, but I feel like this much difference in damage output, plus the infantry and fly keywords and the built-in deep strike, is probably just a bit too much for them to overcome. Overall, currently for Codex Space Marines, I would rate Outriders as just a bit too expensive for what they do really, despite the points decrease. They started out at 115 points at the start of the edition, which was kind of crazily too high. I was wondering if they might compete a little bit better at 95 points, but they still don't seem to. It does look like they just need to be very, very cheap to overcome all their weaknesses. For the biggest issues of the unit, I'd say it's the lack of ability to deal efficient damage to anything with good toughness or armour. It doesn't really get a load better even if you go big investment with Chaplains and the like. And it's perhaps kind of disappointing that they aren't even excessively good against hordes. They're definitely not bad, but they don't really seem to stand out amongst other Space Marine choices. Their special rule is maybe a little bit underwhelming, just auto-advancing 6 is fine and everything, but it's not going to be good unless you've got a detachment that allows you to go on to either charge or shoot afterwards. They don't really have all that many options for supporting them in the Codex. A bit of a shame that they've lost the Bike Captain now, which could have been a way to get them free stratagems, as well as maybe a hidden Power Fist in the unit. Finally, I've seen they perhaps just don't really compare particularly well to other Space Marine units at that kind of points cost. We only looked at the Jump Intercessors, though if you looked at slower moving units like standard Intercessors and things, they'd come out just as bad, if not worse. Overall, I'd probably say that they either need a rules boost or to go down in points a bit. I wouldn't say they're completely unusable in perhaps a more casual list where you want to just run a couple of squads of them because you like the models, but I'd say they're very rarely ever going to make it into any sort of competitive list on the table unless people are utterly committed to making the Stormlance force work. I'd probably be a bit more tempted with them as just a low investment unit rather than a very high investment unit buying in all sorts of things. Perhaps 1 or 2 squads of 3 run down the flanks, skirmishing with light infantry and trading on objectives. I feel like if you can make sure that you hit with them first and hit something that they can kill fairly well, then they could justify themselves in some games, but they're probably really going to struggle against a lot of armies that just have lots of heavily armoured elites and big damage dealers. Outriders playing against things like Knights or Custodies sounds like a bit of a bad time for them. Let me know what you make of the Primaris Bikers though. Look forward to hearing your thoughts down in the comments below. Have you been running any of these in-game since the points cut, and if so, what sort of results have you had with them? If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, or I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support and keep these coming. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with the chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, an enormous thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.